political formations, business, leadership, the diplomatic corps, the media, brothers and sisters from across the country, across our beloved continent, Africa, and all continents that have joined us today in all different time zones. We pass our love, we pass our spirit of Ubuntu to everyone following the 20th Steve Biko Annual Memorial Lecture today. We gather here today to pay tribute to a great and intellectual giant, Steve Bantu Biko, who died on this day in 1977, who we are memorializing today. And this is the 20th Steve Biko Annual Memorial Lecture in which Unisa and the Steve Biko Foundation have partnered. And we are gathered today to make sure that the flame that he lit does not get extinguished. More than 400 years ago, there was a pandemic, and this pandemic has refused to go away despite all the vaccines provided. And 400 years later, we gather here today to reflect on the pandemic of racism, on the pandemic of social injustice. And there is no other fitting leader, the warrior for social justice, and the most recognizable face of the Black Lives Matter across the world, Dr. Reverend Al Sharpton, who is going to deliver the keynote address today, following in the steps of many other leaders who have honored this day, who have honored this lecture. And today we are at that hour that we've been waiting for, and we will be today having our Professor Mandla Makanya, who will introduce this day and make opening remarks. And after him, we will hand over to Nkosinathi Biko, who is the founding member of the Steve Biko Foundation, as well as the son of this great giant that we are celebrating today. And thereafter, Nkosinathi Biko will introduce our keynote speaker, the legend himself, the warrior for social justice, Dr. Reverend Al Sharpton. I will now invite the Vice Chancellor and the Principal of the University of South Africa to make his opening remarks. Professor Mandla Makanya, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Program Director, Dr. Somato Tafikeni. Let me follow suit and greet our own Executive Trustee of the Steve Biko Foundation, Mr. Nkosinathi Biko. I just want at this point to greet our guest of honor, the speaker for tonight, for our lecture, Dr. Reverend Al Sharpton. I also want to greet the members of the family, starting with Umama, Mama Biko, and the children. I also want to greet the group of the 70s. And I want to say once again, thank you so much for being part and parcel of this august occasion. It gives me great pleasure that we are virtually meeting today to commemorate the life of a legendary liberation leader, Bantu Steve Biko, who died on this day in 1977 in the apartheid prison cell after being brutally tortured. As I indicated together with Mr. Nkosinathi Biko last night, in our meeting, that would have loved to host him physically in his motherland, South Africa. But because of the global pandemic of COVID-19 and its restrictions, we've had to explore virtual platforms to hold this lecture. So we are excited that as we do so, we have the entire world converging to listen to the son of the soil. It is an honor for us as the University of South Africa, together with the Steve Biko Foundation, to host the 20th edition of the annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. We therefore extend our gratitude to the Biko family and the foundation for this honor and partnership that we have witnessed grow from strength to strength. Considering what Steve Biko stood for and his relentless struggle against racism, it is most fitting today to invite the most recognizable figure leading the Black Lives Matter at the time when this has now spread across the world in the aftermath of the brutal murder of George Floyd. It is also a powerful reminder of the strong bonds between liberation movements and Pan-Africanism, mutually reinforced from both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. In his seminal book, Souls of Black Folk in 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois proclaimed that, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea," unquote. Little did we know that this problem would become the problem of the 21st century, as well as indicated by resurgence of racism and rise of brutality of security forces towards Blacks. Hence, Blacks' Lives Matter has become a rallying cry for justice. There's no doubt in my mind that we will all agree that this lecture, which marks the 43rd commemoration of Biko's death in the hands of the apartheid state, cannot be undertaken without us reflecting on at least 3 incidents which have touched the Blacks' world in the last few weeks. In America, the world witnessed in graphic details a Black man, George Floyd, pleading for his life and taking his last breath while being choked by a white police officer. Subsequently, there have been many such incidents as they had happened before. In South Africa today, the country is outraged by yet another racist incident in the advertising world of hair products at click stores, which denigrated and insulted Black hair while placing white hair on as the norm. While interest as academics should be to understand the aesthetics or suppression thereof of Blackness and how Blackness responds in the face of humiliation and persistent dehumanization, our question is, how do we understand the deeper meaning of the advert against what Frantz Fanon wrote, quote, "There is a zone of non-being, an extraordinarily sterile and arid region, an utterly naked declivity where an authentic upheaval can be born. In most cases, the Black man lacks the advantage of being able to accomplish this descent into hell," unquote. These are things that we need to keep at the back of our minds because they immediately tell us that we are, of course, running through the lives where all these challenges are consistently raising their ugly head. We also meet against the backdrop of the killing of Natalia Julius, the 16-year-old with Down syndrome from one of the depressed townships in Johannesburg, Eldorado Park. It will again be imprudent for me to comment on the merits of the case, especially as it is being handled by our own IPIT, the Investigations Directorate of the Police Service. It does suffice that Julius' death brings into sharp focus the value of Black life, the dignity of Black people. Connecting us to Reverend Sharpton's home country is the recent incident relating to Daniel Prude, the Black man who was suffocated to death by Rochester police recently. Like George Floyd and many other Black men who lose their lives in the hands of the police, Prude died while struggling to breathe. The overall backdrop against which we made today is of the Black people struggling, suffocating, shouting and crying, "We can't breathe." Steve Biko reflected on these developments and provided us with analytical tools that we must, as both the university and the foundation, and all institutions and organizations need to use to understand and advance the condition of Black people in particular. Thus, on the occasion of the commemoration of Steve's death, I wish to highlight a few vignettes from these giants in art genius. A careful examination of his writings and philosophy reminds us that formal legal abolition of racist system on paper does not necessarily lead to the end of institutionalized racism, which is embedded in the consciousness and finds expressions in the institutions long after their changes. The treatment that Black people receive in the hands of the system, whether in the clique's advert or the suffocation of the streets of Rochester, is a reflection of the institutionalized racism that Black people continue to suffer the world over. Critically, Steve Biko understands that this racism is not isolated. Neither is it a mistake or unconscious bias, as his writings demonstrate. It is these anti-Black attitudes that are still prevalent in our societies, now manifesting themselves outside of state power, which must be confronted. Biko called on Black people to love and respect themselves, just as God made them. He will also urge us, as we are doing today, to understand the interconnectedness of the condition of Black people. Hence, it was also comforting to see the solidarity at the funeral service of Julius, breaking the barriers that apartheid regime had sought to build among Black South Africans, because it did not matter. So I just want to say that with Reverend Sharpton with us today, we are hoisting this flag high. We know that the world is converging also to commemorate the life of Steve. And we are therefore excited to have these reflections. And I just want to say once again to Reverend Sharpton, you are most welcome. We are pleased that you are here to share your wisdom with all of us across the world. We just want to say we extend the hand of solidarity across the oceans to confront the pandemic of racism that has engulfed our communities. At this point, I just want to invite Mr. Nkosinathi Biko to take us forward into our program. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. It's a singular honor to welcome all of you to the 20th Annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. We meet virtually because we live in difficult times. After 28 million infections around the world, we have lost 910,000 people to date to the deadly COVID-19 pandemic. As Black people, we believe that our humanity is indivisible. Therefore, may I kindly request that we take a moment of silence in recognition of this great tragedy. Thank you. Benze baphumle ngonaphakade Nkosi. Ubakhanyisele ngokhanyiso olungacimiyo. May their souls rest in peace. It's 43 years since the murder of one of the founding pillars of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. The Steve Biko Foundation has partnered with the University of South Africa to power this dialogue, which is now in its 20th year. My first acknowledgement goes to Professor Makanya, who joins us for the last year as the outgoing Vice Chancellor of Unisa. Thank you, Prof, for the many years of unassuming, unwavering commitment to this relationship. I must also thank your diligent team of communicators and events personnel who have worked with our own Bruce Waters to make this possible, as I must Dr. Somato Tafikeni for his ever-loyal embrace. In his personal capacity, I'd also like to thank Mr. Kolisa Mabongo out in New York, who is our Deputy Permanent Representative at the United Nations. He is the emissary that made tonight possible. Nangam Somhlegas. When Steve Biko was murdered in 1977, the Minister of Justice at the time, Jimmy Kruger, had the following to say: his death leaves me cold. He could not possibly have imagined that his legacy would survive as a warm feeling that fuels the hearts and minds of many people around the world. This lecture is broadcast live by the national broadcaster in South Africa, as well as Independence, ENCA, Newsroom Africa, on radio, SAFM, all the university radio stations, and numerous community radio stations. We are beholden to BBC and Al Jazeera for bringing this event to the attention of the world through various interviews in preparation for today. Some of these media platforms broadcast across the continent, and therefore we take the opportunity to greet our fellow nations throughout the continent. The Steve Biko Cultural Institute in Brazil, the Steve Biko Housing Association in Liverpool have invited their constituencies to participate via streaming. The National Action Network, of which our esteemed speaker is the founder and president, has done similarly in the United States. We extend a hearty welcome to all our brothers and sisters in the diaspora. And to our fellow South Africans, many of you never tire of joining the annual pilgrimage of honoring this giant of our struggle. You do so in person, in writing, through your messages, your visits, and increasingly through social media. To all participants from all of us who are gathered here at the Steve Biko Center in Ginsberg, South Africa, please accept our sincere greetings and appreciation. Legacies endure triumphantly when they are afforded a warm abode in people's hearts from generation to generation. But like embers from an erstwhile fire, they must from time to time be revived by the gentle glow of fresh air so that they inflame anew and bring life to new fires. The annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture is a resuscitative moment on the national calendar. It uses the interest in the legacy of Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement to focus our attention on the contemporary challenges facing our societies. It does so by linking biography, history, and social action. In the inaugural Steve Biko Memorial Lecture in the year 2000, the author and wordsmith, Professor Njabulani Ndebele, provides a useful framework to begin today's conversation. Commenting on the morality of whiteness under apartheid, he makes the following observation, and I quote, "The combination of political, economic, and military power, validated by religion, yielded a universal sense of entitlement. Apartheid was entitled to land, to air, to water, to beasts, and to each and every black body. Speaking harshly to a black person, stamping with both feet on the head or the chest of a black body, roasting a black body over flames to obliterate evidence of murder, not because murder was wrong, but because it was an irritating embarrassment. Handing to an illiterate black mother, presenting her ailing infant for treatment, a death certificate in order that the white doctor should not be disturbed in the night when the infant dies. These are some of the things one who is white can do from time to time to black bodies in the total scheme of things." Although set mostly in apartheid South Africa, Ndebele's observation describes a world that is all too familiar to many of us, a world that is in the immediate and in the present. The Bill of Rights in South Africa guarantees two ultimate rights. It guarantees them as inviolable. The first is the right to human dignity. Yet, even under 26 years of democracy, many continue to want for a dignified existence. The country is richly endowed, but 54% of our citizens live in poverty. We are the most unequal society in the world, with the widest gap between the richest rich and the poorest poor. Regrettably, the ravaging effects of the pandemic on our economy stand to aggravate both poverty and inequality. The second inviolable right is the right to life. by lacking the political will to prosecute apartheid murders, as was recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the wound has festered under democracy to amass, amongst others, the murders of Andries Tatane in 2011, 34 miners in Marikana in 2012, Mido Micah in 2013, Collins Khosa, and Nathaniel Julius in 2020. As argued above, these transgressions of the right to life and to human dignity present a constitutional violation. Thus, the message of Black Lives Matter should cohere around public outrage, constitutional action, and economic liberty. In the case of the United States, which claims to be the leading democracy in the world, the lived reality for numerous citizens is life on the periphery of democracy. This is the experience that cost the life of Michael Griffith in 1986, Amadou Diallo in 1999, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice in 2014, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery in 2020. In 2019 alone, the police in the US shot approximately 235 Black people to death. 1 in every 1,000 Black men may expect to be killed by police over the course of their lives. They are at least 3.2 times more likely to be killed than their white counterparts. Back in 2000, Dembele bemoaned the fact that instances of the desecration of the Black body have yet to evoke significant expressions of outrage, certainly not to the extent of anything that signals a historic movement towards a new social and moral order. In 1991, they jumped and stamped on Rodney King, setting in motion the wrath of the Black communities in Los Angeles. From the ashes of Trayvon Martin, an ember ignited at the fall of George Floyd. This flame spread into a global fire, a movement that has come to infiltrate corporates, brands, sports fields, and most importantly, a movement that has come to mobilize a critical mass of ordinary citizens. Steve Biko unites that movement tonight. Our dignity and value should not ever be defined by murder. Our dignity is inherent and subsists despite the threat of murder. Faced with the attack on his dignity in police interrogation, Steve Biko had this to say: listen, if you guys want to do this your way, you may have to bind my feet and my hands together. And if you allow me to respond, I'm certainly going to respond. And I'm afraid you may have to kill me in the process, even if this was not your intention. And in signing off, he said, your method of death can itself be a politicizing thing. A leading voice against the atrocities visited on the Black body is Reverend Al Sharpton. For decades, he has made it uncomfortable to be comfortable with silence and indifference. He has been a tireless voice in many cases that affected the African American community and led protests against injustices and incidents of racial discrimination. He is the founder of the National Action Network. Born in New York, he was ordained as a minister in the Pentecostal Church, television and radio show host, as well as a 2004 Democratic Party contender for the United States presidency. His activism continues unabated. Having earlier addressed mourners at the memorial of George Floyd, he most recently organized and led thousands in the Get Your Knee Off Our Necks March on Washington on the 28th of August, 2020, which invoked the Great March on Washington of the same date in 1963, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. From Harlem, New York, It is my pleasure to call upon Reverend Sharpton to deliver the 20th Steve Biko Memorial Lecture titled Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
I understand also the widow of Steve Biko is listening, and the father of our audience, and to all of the family. We send our love and admiration and support from across the Atlantic as we celebrate the life of Steve Biko today around the world. Let me be very personal and clear at the outset. I was a younger man in my 20s when Steve Biko was murdered. And Steve Biko us in the movement. I had been in the movement for several years. That was called the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. And for several years, Steve Biko represented to us something that we could not express in words, but we related to him across the Atlantic and around the African diaspora. If we were to track the movements in the United States, the movements in Latin America, Caribbean, South America, and Africa and Europe, we will find there were always parallels that we moved through history in many ways separated by the miles, but united in the cause of the empowerment and liberation of our people, and united spiritually in what we was trying to do as a people. The Civil Rights Movement started in the early 20th century. It came after we had been enslaved in this country for over 260 years, kidnapped from Africa and made to work in forced, unpaid labor. The first commodity that the United States sold was that of Black African bodies. When you hear of Wall Street, for example, Wall Street was originally one of the places that they brought the slaves in and stood us up to be sold in massive slave trade. Charleston, South Carolina, and the harbor in New York, which is now where Wall Street is, was where black bodies were sold. Those that made it across the Atlantic and served for those 260 some odd years. It was finally after 267 years that there was the division between the northern and southern states around control of the U.S. government. And that battle had as much to do with who was going to control the country and the economy of the country as it was anything else. It has been misinformed that they were fighting slavery. They were fighting over empire, and slavery was the product of the they were not fighting to free us. I think they have a contribution, that there were those that fought for us rather than fighting for their own self-interest. I want us to understand this in our history because I want to tie it into why the struggle in South Africa and around the diaspora, in which Steve Biko represented, because there's that people went to battle and died to free the kidnapped Africans. They went to battle over who were going to be the financial rulers, controllers, and owners of the United States. The main in the South, cotton and tobacco. The reason it enriched American whites is they were able to use free labor, slave, in order to perfect their use of cotton. Anyone could enrich if you were producing that you had no overhead. The Northerners that wanted to have the control, who also some had slave, knew the way to break the monopolistic grip of the South in terms of the cotton and other industries was to research cause. So that's where, as they began, one of the lists that many of had said to Lincoln, who was president of the United States, was one that wanted to address this issue. And they began fighting the white supremacists and the slavery, the Confederates as they are called. There were those that were saying you need to let the slaves, the enslaved, fight in the Union Army, Mr. Biko.
And that there was the Reverend Al Sharpton, who is delivering the annual 20th Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. We do apologize for the quality of the sound. Let's take you back there now.
Soon, and make sure that we have a better line. Sometimes you do have this Murphy's Law in this virtual world. We had done the test and everything, but we will, as soon as we reconnect with Dr. Reverend Al Sharpton, continue with our program. So we are in a process of redialing to get a better connectivity. Thank you for your patience. Meantime, we will be playing the slides that we're playing. As soon as he gets back online, we will be able to continue. Of course, these are the realities of the new world, the COVID world of restrictions and the virtual reality. So we are tested to the limit. Just be patient. We appreciate your patience. We will now play the slides whilst we are trying to establish connectivity. I'll ask for the slides to be played meantime. And we also appreciate the patience of the live broadcasters, the media. Thank you, Reverend Al Sharpton. The floor is yours again. Sorry for that interruption.
Yes, I interrupted. So as the Confederates in the United States South began gaining ground, they finally convinced President Lincoln to let some of the enslaved Africans join the Union Army. And Lincoln freed slaves in the South, allowed them to join the Union, paid little to no wages, nothing compared to the other Union Army soldiers. And they defeated the Confederates, and Lincoln maintained his presidency and the government of the United States. That is why it is a misnomer that many American blacks and Africans around the world have, that Lincoln, in many ways, the enslaved helped free, had they not been in the Union Army to give the budget.
Well, as Professor Somadoda Figeni was saying there with regards to that Steve Biko lecture, the gremlins are in the system, and unfortunately it's a reality of the times that we live in, the digital era, that things can go wrong. But what we're seeing there now, the slides that are being played by the Biko lecture as they try and reconnect with the Reverend Al Sharpton. So if I could just take you through some of what that was said earlier on. Professor Makanya, Unisa's Vice Chancellor, speaking about the resurgence of racism and brutality of security forces against black people, talking about the fact that racial attitudes are manifesting outside of state power, speaking about those three incidents that he says have brought us to where we are as a global community, sharply underscoring the need to reinvigorate, to strengthen the black consciousness movement. And the founder of the Steve Biko Foundation, his son Nkosinathi Biko, also speaking about why it is that Steve Biko's legacy is still relevant, that it is still the fire in the wind, to partly quote some of Biko's teachings as well, because of the systemic racism and discrimination that we're still experiencing. So we will take you back to that lecture as and when the reconnection to Reverend Al Sharpton, who is in the USA, is reconnected successfully. Powerful speaker, Reverend Al Sharpton, a dramatic one, often drawing attention to his causes by the delivery of the strength of what he says. Speaking about him earlier on, it was said that he has made being comfortable in silence uncomfortable, speaking about the fact that he often shoots from the hip. He calls a spade, as they say. So let's see if we can take you back there to that lecture. Professor Somadoda Figeni, who's the program director, is speaking now.
If the slides are playing with no sound, to all our viewers, do get, to understand that they were made that way. We really are.
And it seems that unfortunately, Professor Somato Tafigeni himself experiencing connection problems. It was interesting to hear what Azapo was saying earlier on about how things are so different this year for the Steve Biko commemoration. They normally visit the cell where he died, and they were saying because of COVID that's not possible. Not as many people are able to gather and celebrate his life. And I suppose this really speaks to this, the strange conditions that we're living under. We are unfortunately dependent on technology, the digital era letting us down. But just to reflect on what Reverend Al Sharpton is going to speak about. So his lecture is titled Black Lives Matter. So he had already started speaking, though. He was speaking about the various instances where the movements in the Americas, the Caribbean and African continents were united, and made a very strong statement about how the first commodity that America itself actually sold was that of black slaves, and how that led to the separation of the North and South Americas based on the control of slavery. And of course, if you know about those two, the North and South of America, and their historical role in slavery, you will know that it speaks very much to what we're speaking about here in South Africa, colonialism and apartheid. Some saying that part of the reason we are where we are is because we have failed really as a nation to deal with the very exigencies of the black people feeling marginalized, feeling that their lack of pride has been taken away by the system. And of course, that some saying that it's because we focus too much on political transformation to the detriment of social and economic dimensions. And these are some of the things that have been raised during COVID-19, the inequality, how that has been highlighted. We are seeing now even a report coming out recently by the Minister of Small Business who made a shocking admission that of the COVID funding that was out there, 75% of those that benefited were white-owned businesses, sharply bringing into focus the continuing inequalities, even when it is indeed in the hands of a quote-unquote black state. So we'll be talking about some of these things. Why is it that our children are still forced to go to the streets to fight for basic human dignity? At schools, the ability to study in their own language, to enjoy the pride of being black. Has the Rainbow Nation unwittingly normalized coloniality? This is something that people are questioning. We'll be speaking to some of these points with Professor Linkabula now. And we'll also be talking about what can be done if we're talking about reinvigorating the Black consciousness movement, not only here in South Africa, but globally. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? What have been the failings? All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly. Do stay with us.
We don't believe, for instance, in the so-called guarantees for minority rights.
We live in a new high-tech environment because of the technology.
so-called guarantees for minority rights.
Welcome back. The greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. We continue with these themes as we look at Black consciousness. Steve Biko, his legacy, the 20th annual memorial lecture is set to continue, hopefully, with the Reverend Al Sharpton. It was suspended while they try and prove the connection to the Reverend Al Sharpton. We will take you back there live in just a moment. So we'll continue to reflect on the lifetimes and struggle of the icon Steve Biko. Earlier on, SABC News spoke to Simphiwe Msizi, who's the Black consciousness activist advocating for Biko's legacy.
Yesterday, we were planning to go to the Woma police station cell. As we know, that is his last day in Port Elizabeth was when he was taken from Woma and then put into a police van, naked, manacled, driven to Pretoria, about 1,200 kilometers. And then he died actually this day in the morning. So Woma police station is always the key for us to actually call for the people to remember what actually took place in Port Elizabeth. So Port Elizabeth, it's actually a key place where Steve Biko really received so much torture from the Sanlam building, as people know. As also the Sanlam building has been on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for a number of times, explaining what they did to him. And of course, also at the Woma police station. So Port Elizabeth is always vibe. It's just that we were stopped by the rain actually in the morning because the whole police station is under renovations now. So it was good news for us to hear that the contractors were asked not to touch the cell where Steve Biko was held. So we were looking forward actually to enjoy with some of the different groups actually which are pro-Black consciousness. Really, so we actually looking for these other days that we are going to do. We're going to do commemoration. Just please watch the space in PE. That is what.
Let's take you back now to the Steve Biko 20th annual memorial lecture. Professor Somadoda Figeni is speaking. I believe we do have Reverend Al Sharpton back. Let's take you there now.
Yes, but I certainly want to come as part of what the Biko Foundation does. And so we will not have these difficulties. But let me pick up where I believe we dropped off. And that is that after the Civil War in this country, and Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing some of the slaves in the South. And it went on to a period of Reconstruction, where there were some blacks that were even elected to the Congress and the U.S. Senate. There was this backlash that came about, white supremacists that used terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council and raided and killed at will blacks. And by the beginning of the 20th century, we had lost all that we had gained after coming out of slavery. The danger was not only the terrorist groups on the ground. The danger was not only those with the white robes that were the Ku Klux Klan. The danger was those in the black robes that were the judges, the Supreme Court, that said that there was, in the Dred Scott decision, no rights that a white was bound to respect. They upheld that. They went with other decisions. So as we were being physically accosted, we were being legally stripped down of our humanity, even defined as 3/5 of a man. Why is that important? Because at the turn of the 20th century, as we were savagely beaten, not protected by law, is when they started the policing in this country. At the same time in our motherland, is when there was savage policing and beatings and killings done to our people. Separated by an ocean, but united in white supremacy, that wanted to abuse, enslave, and dehumanize us and use us for economic interest that was protected by the political order. One of the things that we must be careful of is that the political class is there to protect the economic interest. And if we only change the political class and not deal with the economic interest, the economic interest will maintain control and they will keep swapping in and out the political class. Therefore, it is no accident that when we have rallied in America, we would go to the Lincoln Memorial. 2 weeks ago yesterday, we brought tens of thousands to the Lincoln Memorial. 57 years after Martin Luther King went there. And I brought the family of George Floyd, and we brought the family of Breonna Taylor, and we brought the family of Ahmaud Arbery, and we brought the other victims' family. Why do we go to the Lincoln Memorial, not the Washington Monument, not the Jefferson Memorial? Because it was Lincoln that promised the Emancipation Proclamation. It was Lincoln that promised full citizenship. It was Lincoln that went down in history as this great emancipator. Washington didn't promise us anything. He was a slave owner. Jefferson didn't promise us anything. So we go to say, is this going to continue broken promises? It is no accident that as we began fighting the lynchings and the police raiders at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that some went to Niagara Falls, New York, and formed the NAACP and began a resistance movement to save our lives from lynching. In the same decade, the African National Congress was founded in South Africa and began decades of struggle as we have to try and stop killing our people, stop lynching our people. We as a minority in the United States, you as a majority in South Africa. Parallel movements, different methods at times, different ways of dealing with what the leadership would be at times, but the same goal, the empowerment and freedom of our people and the ability to protect our very existence, our very human lives. It was out of those decades of struggle that took us from a W.E.B. Du Bois in this country that was quoted earlier in this program, and a Booker T. Washington, and a Marcus Garvey, all the way to a Martin Luther King. It was out of that that developed a movement in this country that was personified by Steve Biko in South Africa, a movement of Black consciousness, a movement to deal with our interest in knowing and embracing and glorifying who we were. Because what many found was that until we can break the mental and psychic chains in our minds, and until we become in tune with our own self-awareness and reconnect to our history and the glory of who we are, that we will always accept being degraded, being humiliated, and being killed because we have psychologically said that that's the way things are, and we accept it and in some ways even think we deserve it. So the Black consciousness movement that Biko symbolized and personified in South Africa was running parallel and leaped the ocean in the Black Power movement, which immediately followed the civil rights days of Dr. King. Because if you do not think you are worthy, you will not demand to be treated worthy. And if you change people's minds about themselves, you can change their circumstances. That is why it was important with those like a Baraka here and others, even in the cultural arena, James Brown singing Black and Proud. All of that changed our minds about who we were. Because if we had not changed our mind, we would have thought it was all right to beat us in the head because we were less than human anyhow. It did not matter what whites felt about us as much as what we felt about ourselves. And that is why they had to kill Steve Biko. And that is why they had to flood our communities with drugs and kill the ambition and the self-respect and self-regard of Black people. How do you go from a generation of Black and proud and Black power and Afrocentricity and relating across the borders down to something else? You have to numb the brain, fill it with drugs, flood it with crack, and let them lose themselves. Turn them generation against generation. The problem was not white supremacists. The problem was your old school leaders, your mama and daddy. So you'd repudiate your mother and father rather than repudiate who oppressed both generations. And that's why when Biko broke through that Black consciousness, when he started giving self-worth to people in South Africa and it spread around the world, he was dangerous to the state because freedom never comes from the oppressor retired. Freedom comes when the oppressed decide, I must be free and I will not adjust to anything else. And that was the danger of Biko. And that is why we must deal on this 43rd anniversary of his killing with the fact that just like they used the enforcers of the white supremacist orders of that day, order of that day, to kill Biko, it is the same way that they express themselves with police brutality here. What gives somebody the mentality to put his knee on the neck of a human being that is narrating his own death? Think about that. As you watch that video of George Floyd, he begins begging for his life. He begins saying, I can't breathe. He starts all kind of pleas. He is actually narrating the life drained out of him. Yet this man will not believe his name. I, at the funeral, as I gave the eulogy, asked everyone to stand. They were watching around the world. And to be silent and stand for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I got all kinds of tweets and emails saying, I stood 3 minutes and I couldn't stand anymore. That's standing. Imagine the venom and hatred you must have to press your knee 8 minutes and 46 seconds into a man's pulsating neck. All within the same month, we see Breonna Taylor, a Black first responder woman, killed by police in her own home, in her own bedroom, when they broke in with a no-knock warrant, looking for the wrong person at the wrong address and killed her. We saw Ahmaud Arbery jogging in Brunswick, Georgia. Doing nothing wrong, no criminal act, and is hunted down and killed. All of this within the same few weeks. During a pandemic, during a shutdown. And what helped to explode this movement was that while people were shut down with no sports, no football, no baseball, no basketball, they couldn't watch anything but the news, and they were watching the news hoping that the newscasters will tell them things are leveling off, you can go back outside, you can go to work, you can go to play. And while watching that, all they could see was the video of George Floyd, Muhammad Ali, Breonna Taylor, on and on. And for the first time, the psyche of the country shifted to say, wait a minute, this should not be happening. That is where this new season of the Black Lives Matter, that whether we be in civil rights groups or local grassroots, everything began moving with new energy. The Black Lives Matter started as a slogan, but 3 brilliant young sisters that put it up, and it became a slogan the night that a white wannabe cop, George Zimmerman, killed Trayvon Martin, and he was acquitted that day, and they wrote Black Lives Matter. The genius of the expression, which started as what is called a hashtag, is that not only were they saying to the criminal justice system in the U.S. that we matter, they were saying to black people that had been beat down that we matter. And as long as we matter to ourselves, we will refuse to accept being brutalized and belittled by anyone else. That is ultimate Steve Bikoism. We've got to matter to ourselves. We've got to embrace ourselves. We've got to love ourselves. And we know we will be challenged. Yes, they fought every way they could not to give political power to black people in South Africa in the majority of the population in their own land. They fought here in the United States when we were a minority. They killed people, white and black, that fought to give us the right to vote. And then even after we got the right to vote, they changed laws to try to water it down. And we kept striving, we kept fighting, electing blacks to Congress, electing blacks to the U.S. Senate, electing black governors, finally electing a black president, and sure it's not improved, re-elected. Just like, as I told you, that there was the backlash after Reconstruction in the 1860s and 70s into the 90s. And just like we lost all the members of Congress at that time, there was a backlash in the United States that, wait a minute, these blacks have gone too far politically. They have empowered themselves. They elected a black man whose name was not even commonly known, and re-elected. And soon they will mess with the money, they mess with the economic order. We must stop them. Backlash time. How is the backlash personified with the man named Donald Trump, who ran on the premise of saying that the black president was not even an American. Birtherism. He wasn't born in Hawaii, he was born in Kenya. Make him illegal. Because the psychology of that is America is white and male. And we cannot let this illegal African, that's what he said, Obama, become something that is accepted and permanent. They then start breaking down our economic dominance. So we will have one that is a personification of economic dominance, real estate. Never had office, but appeals to our bigotry and play on it, become the president. Oh, Sharpton, you just saying that because he's in a different party. He said, Robert Mugabe, after taking office, he said African nations were S-hole countries, and so was he. He said that he never saw an African country or country run by blacks. well. That's who he is, and that was the son. So the reason why it is so important on this 43rd anniversary of Steve Biko is to go back to his writing and his speeches, because we cannot let our not re-embrace and recommit to what Biko taught us all over the diaspora. We love to embrace what we love. Know that we are uniquely created by God and walk with the culture and heritage unmatched anywhere. Because if we can bring that mentality with, we will accept no person like Trump, no cop as us. We will accept no one in South Africa on the economic order and letting us have the type of political to manage the system that protects them and their wealth, and not worry about the masses, about people. You judge liberation not by the people at the top. You judge it by the masses at the bottom, whether they embrace it. We are in a time of real challenge. And the challenge is how we think of ourselves and how we define our struggle. We must be careful that we do not let others define for us what we must do for ourselves and where our liberation lies. There are those in South Africa and the U.S. that want to act as allies and want to tell us where freedom is and what it means, and select our leaders and decide who is appropriate to them and acceptable to them. We are not looking for better slave masters. We're looking to be free. And we will work with anyone, any race, but do not dictate to us, because we are equipped and able to lead and stand for ourselves. That's what Biko told us. And we refuse to go back on that. The consciousness, the spiritual depth in us that made us survive the rape of Africa, where we were delegated to second and third class citizenship in our own nations. The rape and forced labor of us in the U.S., where we survived on a diet of hard guts and wild plants growing and made it anyhow. It was against the law for us to marry and name our children after us, yet we survived. We are a unique, strong people with strong spiritual connection. And we have defeated more than the forces that are out there now. Those business forces that want to control Africa. Those forces in the United States represented by Trump. We have defeated their fathers and grandfathers. If we know who we are, if we're not victims of false amnesia that tell us to sever with that old one. Why are you talking about Biko? That was yesterday. That is the roots that we gain our strength from. You don't judge the strength of a tree by its branches. You judge it by its roots. And we're rooted in the Bikos. We're grounded in those that walk when there was no guarantee they would win. And when we are reaching down into that strength, we can handle those that we're dealing with now, because our forefathers had. That's why in 94 we took the political system to South Africa. We must finish the economic journey to finish closing the circle of liberation. That's why in the up with us, but know the destination is what we have determined as a self-empowered people. Why don't we go to work? And I cannot forget that you cannot force me. If I were to leave here in New York and head to Johannesburg, if I got on a flight, I would know in a matter of 16 to 18, 19 hours whether I arrived. But if I got on a flight and someone sitting next to me said, I'm your friend, Reverend Al, I'm your buddy, but let's not go to Johannesburg, let's go to Paris. We might land and have a smooth flight and have fun in Paris, but you changed my destination and I did not have a successful trip because I allowed you to detour me. No detours. Don't let anyone change our destination. What they fought for when they started the anti-apartheid movement, keep going for full emancipation. That is economic and political and social and educational. That's what we must do in these states. And we must not let them define who our heroes are. And not let them demonize those that stood up for us because they deemed them too controversial or too aggressive. Oh, y'all make too much noise. Oh, Biko was too extreme. How do you tell people that you pressed to the ground and how do you tell me how loud I should scream or how I should react? We can all have different ways that we react, but rather than argue about the reaction, go Sharpton, go march, or somebody else don't do this. The issue is not how we react, the issue is what we're reacting to. And if we come together, we will resolve and solve what it is that caused reaction in the first place. The crabs in the barrel mentality, where we all snatching each other down. One black rises, we fight and snatch them down. That happens in the States, that happens in South Africa. But I suggest to you, this anniversary of Steve Biko, the way that crabs in the barrel can be free, they start climbing on each other and put the energy toward ripping off the lid on the barrel. If we get the lid off, there's a better room for us. Rather than out crawling on each other's backs to each other down. That's the consciousness of people that understand that when God created man, and that we are not mistakes that God made. Do you ever watch nature? Isn't it interesting that in this solar system, planets don't run into each other? Sun never collided. Everything works in divine order and precision. So what makes you think that God got to us and made his first mistake? We are not a mistake of God. We are the children of God. We are the ones that can bring the course of the world back in order with treating people with respect, with humanity, and to celebrate our blackness and to celebrate the God that made us. How can you call yourself a God and then tell me to be ashamed of the rich wealth God was superb growth? Yes, I celebrate Biko because when I was in a mission out of Japanese to wake me up, we're woke now. The young people here to woke well. Biko was one of them that woke us up. No police 43 years ago. Even though you could take his breath, you could not put us back to sleep. That's why Black Lives Matter in the streets of the United States. That's why you see people in townships in South Africa saying, no, we've got to do the economic condition. You killed Biko, but you did not message before you can get there. And we do that if we just change our mind. Our mind gets behind. So thank you, Steve Biko. You never knew you'd be a good black man that you were. And you caused a mental and psychic revolution that has changed us. Yes, we go through setbacks, we get dark period now. But if we are the children of light, darkness does not intimidate us. It will keep us. Because the light's in us, we like the path and we will be where we're destined to be. Again, a lot of things. Sorry to tell you. Thank you. Very much, Reverend Al Sharpton, for such a passionate address. We really apologize for the technical challenges in terms of sound, and will make amends in two form and see possibilities of a recording and a rebroadcast, as well as bringing you to your mother continent. That is a promise we make. That is a promise we'll keep, so that you are here in person, and in between us, there is no virtual reality and there is no platform challenges. Again, words are inadequate to express our gratitude for all the people who have made this program possible, from our keynote speaker, who despite his very punishing schedule, as a sign of solidarity across the Atlantic, he availed himself and he made this clarion call a call to action, and the world will not be the same again. And again, would like to thank the leadership of Unisa, the leadership of the Steve Biko Foundation, the Biko family. Would like to thank all those people who worked behind the scenes, Police Amabongo in New York, and the media, all the participants, as well as those who are still going to approach to make amends in the media. And that in itself, I think is going to be very, very important that we do that. And for people across all different places where we are watching this, would like to thank you. Enkosi Kialebocha, Asante Sana, merci beaucoup, muchos gracias, obrigado. Thank you, and watch out for the rebroadcast, and we will try to make sure that a better quality is the one that will go for rebroadcast. Thank you very much, and that brings this lecture to the end.
And that there is Professor Somadoda Figeni, who was the program director of that Steve Biko 20th annual memorial lecture. And as he said, they will make amends. I think amends are very much needed. Lots of us were disappointed. We're really looking forward to a spirited lecture by Reverend Al Sharpton. So, of course, it was as passionate as Professor Figeni said, but unfortunately the sound quality let us down. So let's unpack this now. Black consciousness is a transcendence that connects generations, which in Frantz Fanon's watchwords, in the wretched of the earth, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. Very profound words. So this has been pretty much the temperament, the sentiment of the lecture, speaking about the black cause, why it is that black consciousness is important today, it's relevant, and why it's a global movement. But it is, of course, looking back at the teachings of Steve Biko. Professor Puleng Lenkabula is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Institutional Change, Student Affairs and Engaged Scholarship at the University of the Free State. She joins us now to unpack the Reverend Al Sharpton's speech. A very good evening to you, Professor, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So, obviously, it was very difficult to hear and follow, but he said some very interesting and important things. He spoke about how we, as a black people, are strong spiritual people who've survived unspeakable cruelty. We are as strong if we know who we are. And I think this is pretty much underscores it. So who are we? If we talk about black consciousness in South Africa as a global movement, who are we as a people?
Thank you very much, Tapiso, for inviting us this evening. I want to reaffirm what you stated around the lecture by Reverend Al Sharpton. I think the key issues that he raised, which I find resonant to the context of South Africa, the African continent, but also the invitation for us to always affirm the dignity of black people is primarily because historically we have gone through iterations that have tried to strip us from dignity. For instance, we went through slavery, we went through colonialism, we are dealing with the implications of neocolonialism. This may sound just as conceptual issues, but the truth is that in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, the conquest over black bodies was expressed through trade regimes, political oppressions, as well as the total annihilation of communities. If we were to take the transatlantic slavery, for instance, majority of people were taken and in their flight to Euro-American context, they were stripped of dignity. Therefore, the black consciousness as an ideal is that invitation saying, despite these experiences, the humanity, the fullness of dignity must always be affirmed. And I like what Reverend Sharpton particularly said, because when he made the analogy, white supremacy then, white supremacy now, in the context of the killing of black bodies, he also, in some way, in similar ways to Steve Biko, is reminding us about the hypocrisy of injustices and those who claim that they're in solidarity with black folks when they're not. So for instance, we know that during the French Revolution, when the French themselves were seeking liberation, egalitarianism, and so on, when the Haitians were asking for the same freedom, for the same liberation, for the same idea of dignity, this was not available. That was the first hypocrisy that we should have been aware of as black people. But the colonialism of Africa, for instance, the flight of black people, resources, the complicity with white supremacy, whether in the arrangements related to economic system or in the political arrangements, cannot be contested.
And Professor, let me just jump in there, because one of the things that he did also speak about, and this is very much in line with what you're saying, about how the political classes are there to protect the economic power. A lot of this has been said about the South Africa in the here and the now, saying that the vestiges of apartheid colonialism are still in place, and that this current government continues to administer it rather than showing leadership to get us out of this quagmire that the black people find themselves in. So looking at what Reverend Al Sharpton was speaking about. He spoke about how South Africans who are the majority and African Americans who are black South Africans and African Americans who are the minority there still follow a parallel journey.
I think we must make this complex, Tapiso. Whereas it is true that African Americans are a minority, I think we should not also underestimate the complexity of white supremacy, its systems of violence, but also its political systems to silence those who are actually contesting around its might. So whilst in South Africa, Black people may be in the majority, the reality is that the economic distribution is not in that way. And as such, the question that must be asked, and I think which is resonant to the questions that Biko had also posed to our society, is therefore, what are the tools that we consistently apply in order to transform economic systems, not to have a hollowed out democratic system that does not speak to the bifurcation of society. And that can only be done if, first and foremost, the leadership of South Africa, but also of the African continent, harness the intellectual resources that are important to nurture society, to promote the fullness of dignity of people, and also to contest the might of empire. One of the challenges that we're facing now in the so-called context of globalization, of digitalization, is the fact that the state, as I add, and this is a conversation that political scientists might contest me on, is that the state is now in the service of capital instead of being in service of itself and of citizens. And this is not a challenge of South Africa. It's a global challenge where those who hold the resources are abusing, and majority of them are not Black folk. So if we understand nexus of militarism, of violence, of economic systems that annihilate this, it may be the intention by the South African government is to transform. But given that they're playing within a global system where they are on the margin, then it's a challenge. And I think Sharpton makes it clear that we must claim justice, must claim freedom. And without claiming it, we can never transform.
But how do we do that if the instruments to do that are failing us? And I'm talking about multilateralism here. He hinted at that when he was saying that the Americas, Africa, have allies who pretend to be allies because they want to tell us what freedom looks like. And if the global Black consciousness movement is to be anything but a blood instrument, where are its failings? Let's identify that. What should it be doing to improve the lot of Black people?
Yes, definitely. I think, Tapiso, one of the key issues that politicians and political leaders must do is to stop extricating themselves from their commitments to transforming the economic plight of Black people in particular, but also of their society. And I'm particularly naming Black people because the faces of poverty in South Africa, anywhere in the world, are often of women and of Black people. And I think in I Write What I Like, Steve Biko makes a cogent point that it is not just the articulation or assertion of our dignity by affirming our Blackness, our conscientization to the challenges that we experience, but it is in the effort to ensuring that we create the logic, the grammar, the political agitation for change of society, for affirming the dignity of Black people, for recognizing in the same way that Fanon as well says, or Katie Cannon, or Madipwani Masiya are asserting that unless we love Black people, unless we respect Black people, unless we realize that their dignity has to be asserted, the political question will not be responded.
I want to talk about the political landscape and what it has to offer. Reverend Al Sharpton speaking about, for instance, Steve Biko saying that some thought that he was radical, but how do you tell an oppressed person how to react to their oppression? But another important thing I want to talk about is he was saying that instead of, and I quote, instead of involving themselves in an all-out attempt to stamp out racism from their white society, liberals waste a long time trying to prove to as many blacks that they can that they are indeed liberal. I want to talk about a political landscape, what it has to offer. Is there anything that supports the cause of black consciousness? And in expressing black consciousness, is there a certain sector of society that feels threatened by this, the love for self?
I definitely think for those who have internalized racism, which is that notion of in the Americas and also here at home of Uncle Tom, or those who want to be in the service of white supremacy, would always be uncomfortable and embarrassed to affirm the imperative for the dignity of black people. And I think what Sharpton is reminding us is that unless we are deliberate around understanding the plight of black people, and unless we are conscientious around the fact that multilateral arrangements are about political and economic interests of Euro-American, and I dare say now the Asian superpowers are extracting so much from our societies. I think it's important that political mobilization, whether it's by political parties or whether it's by individual citizens, must recognize this historical anomaly that have negated black people. And for us as black scholars, this starts with ensuring that the curriculum and agenda of learning in higher education institutions assert and affirm African and blackness, that we are conscious around those impediments that were put in place to disable us, but not also continue blaming the other without demonstrating that transformative emancipatory agenda. And therefore, such an agenda, I'm stating, why is it impossible for political parties that are committed or that claim to be committed to the plight of transformation and conscientization of African people not working together? Why is it impossible that the African continent, you find presidents, all of them going to China at the same time, Jinping, when they could actually invite China to come to Africa, because China's interests, for instance, are as comparable as Africa's interest to its own developmental trajectory. It is that insulting dehumanization that some of the political elite, as well as the economic elite, have demonstrated, that makes it sometimes an impediment for youth and other young adults who want to rally around the restoration of dignity of black people, that sometimes stifle these opportunities.
Thank you so much, Professor Puleng Lenkabula from the University of the Free State. I wish we had more time, but thank you so much for speaking to us, unpacking the lecture that was delivered a short while ago by the Reverend Al Sharpton, a political, civil, human rights activist who is delivering the 20th annual Steve Biko Memorial Lecture. And the university has promised, Unisa of South Africa has promised to give us a recording with better sound so that we can